Ray, did you get my heads up out there? I appreciate it.
You took it back.
Yeah, I tried to break his toe, but I did pull all the showers down.
Well, she's close to
Okay, folks on Zoom, can you see our home slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna get started. I may have gone a little bit dark. Would you hit that number 2 on the wall there, Ray? That went a little too far.
No problem. No worries.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, that should be coming through. Should be coming through. The doodads. All right. Make sure that works. Okay, we're lined up. Thank you, Ray. Thank you. Well, we're going to get started. I appreciate everybody who's here in the room, and thanks for everybody who's with us on Zoom. I'm Jimmy Barrera. I'm the president of the North Texas Archaeological Society, and welcome to our April 2022 meeting. So what a bumper spring out there. I know that a number of us have already discovered that it's a good year for poison ivy. So, and as archaeologists, that's something we're familiar with, and it's quite the crop. So, some announcements before I turn over to our guest speaker. We've had a number of activities that are North Texas Archaeological Society activities over the last month. So I know that we're very excited about that. We're proud of that, and I appreciate everybody who has helped put those together, who's hosted those. Dr. Whitley and Chris Mice and other folks. And I hope that we can continue that sort of momentum. That's a lot. That's a lot of volunteer work on everybody's part, and I recognize that. But I appreciate that, and I hope that our membership is able to participate as possible. It's been a good spectrum. You know, we've had survey work and lab work and excavation work and other kind of activities. So our May guest speaker, Dr. Leslie Bush. We're pretty excited. Dr. Bush has been working with the Catamount State Historic Site, and I know they're in the works on reconstructing their cattle house, and Dr. Bush is certainly part of that. And so I think she'll be talking not just about that, but you know, obviously the topic title here, cattle houses in East Texas from AD 900 to 1834. So that'll be very interesting. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Bush, she's a paleobotanist, archaeobotanist, a variety of things that I'm not that familiar with, but she certainly is. And then we should certainly make sure that we're getting the word out about the Texas Archaeological Society Field School. So everybody's gearing up for field school. And last year, our society had 50 members attend, which is quite a bit. You know, out of the 300 or 350 people that attended from all over, not just Texas, but other states. And I think there's even some international folks that attend here and there. So that's quite a few NTAS members attending field school. And that was just last year. So this year, I'm sure it's going to be a big number. But if you haven't attended field school, ask anybody in the society, including myself. It's a great event, and you have a variety of opportunities. You could do lab work, survey, excavation. There are workshops where they're training on cemetery recording the use of geophysical survey kind of stuff. And so it's a great opportunity to make friends and meet other kind of like minds. So if you're interested in scholarships, NTAS has scholarships available. We've awarded at least one so far for 2022 for the field school, and we're looking for other folks to apply. New members, welcome to all of our new members. If you're here in the room or on Zoom, I want to welcome you guys, and I appreciate y'all joining the society. I hope you enjoy your membership. And just like field school, if you have any questions about the North Texas Archaeological Society, please reach out to your fellow members. It's an active group, and there's all kinds of experience within the society. So Ray, that is bumping the projector just a little bit, just so you know. I think it was pulling the cord. Free student membership, so we just keep that up there. We have awarded a few of those this year. I'm not sure the exact number, but somewhere around 3 or 4 or so. So we have plenty more to give away. So if you're involved with students, let them know, have them apply. And then just a reminder on our scholarships for all the Texas Archaeological Society events. So that's not just field school, but the upcoming annual meeting, which will be in October. That's another great one to apply for. All right, so then a couple of events that are happening fairly soon. There's a program on archaeology in Granbury, and Mr. Steve Lowe let me know about that. So that's an in-person event. So if you have interest, look up the Bridge Street History Center, and then I think it's free. The tickets are free, but you have to get tickets.
Right.
Is that right?
They're free online.
Okay. Steve said the tickets are free online, but you have to go there and get that for attending this in-person event. And then April 22nd, we're supposed to have another workshop that Dr. Whitley is hosting. Do you want to say anything about that?
Just come on out. We have the archaeological site, the Baku archaeological site. You'll be working on artifacts from that active site and learning how to catalog, analyze, and prepare things for a session.
All right. All right. Thank you, Dr. Whitley. All right. And then hot off the press, I pestered our dear friend Chris Mice earlier today. The Clovis field site folks, have been generously continuing to work out there. And so Chris provided those dates. And so I would pencil that in if you have not been to the Clovis field site, or if you have been, but great opportunity to get out and do some excavation and other sorts of field work. I know they're probably working on some other stuff too, potentially lab work and things like that. And you have the opportunity to work with the Galt School of Archaeological Research, because they're connected to this project, along with the North Texas Archaeological Site. So it's a good opportunity. But keep in mind that site is in Mills County, and Mills County is at least a couple-hour drive from here. So it's not just down the street. And with that, I will introduce our April guest speaker, Mr. Brad Jones. Brad, I want to give you the floor, but bear with me. I got to switch out our slides. All right. Okay. That works. Easy peasy. Has a little pointer, green dot. Set up here.
Am I projecting?
Not projecting. Oh,
Not
sound. You have to probably switch the little button on.
Now, am I projecting? Yes, I'm projecting. Great, because I usually talk pretty loud and I need to be projected. All right, well, while Jimmy's voice seems to have everything fired up. So I know his head's in front of me, so nobody's seeing me. I am here. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. This is actually only my second
Let me just make sure that works.
presentation back out in the wild since COVID. I have been out in public, but it's exciting to actually be back talking to people. And it's cool. We get to now have hybrid world where we get to Zoom and be in attendance. So I guess that just doubles the amount of people who can point out all the flaws in this talk. Let's just go ahead and move to the first slide. I guess I should introduce myself since Jimmy didn't. I'm Brad Jones. I am the current state archaeologist and division director for the archaeology division of the Texas Historical Commission. I'm also the deputy state historic preservation officer for archaeology. But I've been with the agency for 13 years now. I was hired as the collections manager. I still have that title too. So I find myself talking a lot about collections, and a lot of what we're talking about today is collections or projects that I was not actually directly involved in. And I feel like that's a very important thing to start this talk with. I'm going to talk about a lot of projects that were done, beginning back in the 70s, then THC projects that were done in the 90s, primarily early 2000s, when I was off doing other things in other countries. But since I came to the THC, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of these collections, primarily as the collections manager. So I've become very involved in them. So I'm going to talk like they're my own. I feel like they're my own in many ways. I've lived with these projects for years now. But I do want to recognize that all the work and a lot of the research, I'll try to give everybody the credit they deserve as I go through, but it's really the hard work of numerous people before me that even give me the opportunity to stand up here and give this talk. So Stone Age peoples of Texas, 1554 to 1726 AD. The titles, I don't know, it's kind of snarky when I wrote it. And it's really meant to, it's really talk about my own kind of changing perspective on archaeology and lithic technology and how we interpret it. Because when I started out my career many years ago, I would not have thought I would ever be giving a talk about Europeans using lithic technology, because that's what this is about. The point of this talk is to really kind of take apart the idea of the Stone Age person, this sort of notion I think we've all been ingrained with, that that's in the past, it's something more primitive, it differentiates huge chunks of time, and there's a certain, of course, heuristic validity to that. But I think taken too literally, the way I used to take it, it becomes problematic in the way we interpret sites. So a lot of this talk is really about interpreting sites, not using artifacts to interpret sites so much, but to look at sites and use them to interpret the artifacts in much more of a sort of dialectical way. I think too often, and for various obvious reasons, and actually it's a really great kind of conversation on TexArcL last week about brownstone Paleo-Indian tools. We become so wedded to some of these ideas, we often don't see what may be right in front of our faces. So this talk is just me stitching together different projects to talk about the way lithic technology existed within the European sphere in Texas, and how that interconnects with Native American traditions and how it impacts the way we interpret the archaeology. Okay. So again, most of us, if you work in Texas and you don't know what stone tools are or what debitage is, I don't know where you're working. It's really nearly impossible to get away from stone artifacts. In the way that ceramics are, when I worked in Peru, lithic technology and tools are key to the way we look at the past and time here. And of course, most of what we're looking at is the result of Native American manufacture and cultural traditions over thousands and thousands of years. And these are just a few examples I put up from sites in section 41 VT 129 down on Guadalupe River in Victoria. It's a site I've been working on, and these are just pretty common types of objects we see. Perdiz, we could argue about the fine typological elements of this. I'm just calling in Perdiz for purposes here. What they call a knuckle points up there, and pretty solidly associated with the Karankawa, the other related groups that lived along the coast, both before and after European colonization. But what I'm really here is to talk about people with funny mustaches, like LaSalle. Sorry, I feel like every European in the past apparently had a fabulous mustache. and just how they also interacted with lithic technology, because in working on these early French and Spanish colonial sites, lithic technology is not uncommon. And so I just want to kind of walk us through this notion. And I want to start by going back to, one of the earliest shipwrecks in North America that's been excavated, a really key project for us, the 1554 shipwrecks. Now, this is a blatant recognition that this is the 50th anniversary of the excavation of these by what would become the THC as well as UT Austin back in the 70s. And I just want to tell you that the THC will be promoting this project to death. So if you like the story, go on and look at Amy's blog about Sarah Lee Connor, and just look out for more and more information that'll come out. But for those of you who may not know what the 1554 shipwrecks are, they're a set of 3 ships which in 1554 wrecked off the southern island of the coast of southern Padre Island. They had been leaving Mexico. They were headed back to Spain. They were carrying gold and silver, passengers, other goods from the New World back to Spain. When they wrecked, about 300 people were aboard the vessels. The archival record's a little confusing. Essentially, about 300 people die. In the end, about 26 people are saved, sail back, or 1, possibly 2 individuals actually walked to safety. Some of them did try to walk, the survivors. This is where it gets confusing. One account says it's 300. Archival evidence sounds like maybe it's more like 30, but whatever. Point is, most of them didn't make it because it's a long way to a port in Mexico. They did not realize how far away they were. And probably you guys at home can read this better than anybody in this room. But it was a long way walking back to Mexico. Most didn't survive, primarily due to not too friendly locals. But the Spanish did eventually come back to the wreck in 1554 and did salvage it. So they got about 70% of the plate and silver. This is one of those things that I just think is amazing, that in the 1550s, if a ship wrecks, like, they send out salvors and they go down and they do the same thing marine archaeologists do hundreds of years later, just with less sophisticated equipment. And then essentially the ship kind of falls into legend. It was known that there was something off the coast, in the 19th and 20th centuries, because coins would wash up on South Padre Island. But essentially the wrecks had been lost. And until recently, the story we told was that they were found by the Platoro group. But thanks to Amy Morgan's recent research, we actually realized what we should have known the whole time, because we did know, was that the first person to actually identify these wrecks is a woman named Vida Lee Connor, who was kind of a socialite down in the Corpus Christi area and was looking for reefs and found these odd things on the seafloor, and she marked them. Now later, Platoro would come and actually then salvage these exact same wrecks. And Platoro is an Indiana salvage company. And in 1967, when they showed up to salvage the wrecks, Texas didn't have an antiquities code law. And I don't think there was a big issue until people realized what was coming out, which was gold and silver, and then it became a very big issue. And the state of Texas decided to take action. They put a temporary restraining order. You guys can read. Long story short, eventually the state of Texas retrieved the material that the Platoro company had in Indiana. Curtis Tunnel went up with Texas state troopers. It's a story I always heard, which it's kind of a cool image. And what, for us as an agency and for a state, we got out of it was the Antiquities Code of Texas. So this wreck, not only is it what is still the oldest excavated shipwreck in the Americas, and one of the first scientifically excavated shipwrecks, is also, the cause of our Antiquities Code, which gives me a job and protects antiquities. You all know it. I hope you all love it. But so this is, a special site for us. But after the Antiquities Code was written, enacted, the THC and UT Austin went out and did actual excavations on the wrecks themselves. And this is what it looks like. This is some of the just images of the research vessels. I've been told that the pointer doesn't work for the people at home, so I'm just not going to use it. But on somebody's left, yeah, on your left, you can see a large anchor, which had been pulled up from the bottom. You can see the research vessels, and then on the far lower right, you can see a lot of the artifacts that were recovered, which were actually conserved at Tarl at the time by Donnie Hamilton. This was sort of where he cut his teeth in conservation, and he'd later go on to found the conservation research lab at Texas A&M, and really sort of a father of conservation, both in Texas and in the marine archaeology more broadly. And just to kind of show you that, this is an example of when they pull up those anchors and other iron objects, what's beneficial for archaeologists is the iron reacts with the seawater and it creates concretion around it like concrete. And it has a tendency to envelop surrounding artifacts. So this is an X-ray of not that same anchor, but a similar anchor from the shipwreck. And you can just see within it pieces of wood, different objects that would later be taken out by the conservators and individually conserved and analyzed. So a lot of the archaeology of the ship, unlike La Belle, which you'll see, and you've probably all seen before, which was nicely intact, this was much more of a scatter across the seafloor that had been salvaged. It had been churned up over the years by the surf. So it's not a pristine site, it's sort of chunks and pieces. And it's been published quite well, and I guarantee you the books look a lot better than, I don't know what's going on in that slide. I forgot to change it out. But the main book is The Nautical Archaeology of Padre Island by Bardo Arnold and Bob Weddell. And all of these publications we have as PDFs. If you will contact me or Amy Borgens, if you're interested, we will give you a copy. I mean, feel free to go out and buy the book. It's now several $100s on eBay and whatnot. And you got a lot of really amazing 16th century archaeology out of it. Iron tools, the small wooden cross with gold around it, a couple pieces of gold, lots of actual Spanish plate silver. Other tools, these are bombards, which are the cannons aboard here in the lower right. Yeah. And I feel like there's a slide missing, but nonetheless, and these are all obviously conserved and cleaned. They did not come out of the ocean looking like this. And among the different artifacts that were there were some that Weddell and Bardo talked about and wrote up very briefly, which were obsidian blades. That was pretty interesting for a 1554 shipwreck. They had sort of posited very briefly in the report that these were perhaps either curios or might have been used for some sort of cutting. They weren't really sure. Harry Schaefer at the time tried to take a look at them and see if they had edge wear. Unfortunately, these were basically pulled out of concretions. So a lot of the edge damage, it's very hard to tell if that was a factor of the actual wrecking event, the removal, but it looked like they might have been used. You can tell they're not in good shape. These are not beautiful blades, but that is what they are. They're 4 individually identifiable obsidian blades that were recovered. I say 4 because based on them, we've got basically 4 platforms, 4 blades with unique faceting patterns that we can pick out. And they were recovered from 2 contexts, one of which is, well, okay, God, I hate doing this. On your left at the top is one concretion, and there was just a small fragment of a blade that came out of that one. And then there was another anchor which had 3 blades in it together. So 156, that's basically one context, and 145 is the other. So what is interesting, I'll just say really quick about 156, is that in this case, 2 of the blades were actually found stacked on top of each other, which I'll kind of go back to. I think it's significant, and I think it shows they're at least in their original packing position. So at the time when they did the excavations, there weren't many shipwrecks which had been excavated, and there weren't any with obsidian on them. So again, minor footnote. As we went into the collection, thinking about the 50-year anniversary, we were starting to ask, like, what can we do with different objects? So I decided obsidian, that's pretty low-hanging fruit. I called up Tom Hester and said, you know, can you help me out if I can get these out of here, and can we get them analyzed? And he was like, of course. And, you know, to make the story a little more interesting, in the interim, at least 2 other shipwrecks have been encountered with obsidian blades on them. One I have yet to get the report on. It is a Cuban excavation. I don't know much about it other than the archaeologists, and this is basically John Bratton provided this information in his reports. Interpret them as possible medical instruments, which I think is interesting. And then the other are from the 1559 De La Luna wrecks, which I was particularly excited about because it's only 5 years later than our shipwrecks. And these were done, excavated by the University of West Florida. This is an ongoing project they've been doing for years. It's a really cool story. Tristan de la Luna, much like LaSalle later, would go on to found a colony and really not have a good go of it. Their ships were wrecked by hurricanes. It just was all around a general disaster. But they left some archaeology, and in that archaeology was obsidian. And fortunately, they had already had theirs sourced. So when I went into this, I already had something I could compare it to. Now, theirs is a little different. They actually have an obsidian core, which is pretty interesting. But once I got ours analyzed and we compared them, so here's ours. We ran a sample of each of the 4 blades. We did them with the, oh God, I'm totally blanking on it. Michael Glascock, Missouri reactor folks. And what their study showed was what I know most people had suspected, is that the obsidian is from the central basin of Mexico, from the Sierra de las Navajas, which very famous Pachuca obsidian. It's got a green cast to it. It's very famous. And what we found was that, in fact, our samples came from, 3 of them were from the Sierra de Pachuca, and then a 4th one was from a different site called Zicualtepec. When you overlay the results from the Tristan de la Luna site, what you find is a very similar pattern. They also have some, and it's called the Emmanuel Point wreck here. That's what that means. Very similar locations. And so what you can see is what others have written about in central Mexico, which is in the 16th century. Obsidian production is still ongoing, and may, depending on who you listen to, may actually have increased at a certain point during the Spanish colonial period, or at least become more decentralized. So this was pretty exciting because, you know, those blades got on that vessel from central Mexico. And it seems to be a pattern. And you know, what it's saying is that people who are most likely of European descent are purchasing and bringing with them obsidian blades, and for various reasons. Because what's interesting about the 2 sites in comparison is the 1554 shipwrecks they were a return fleet. They're going back to Spain. They're taking people and things to Spain. They're not a colonial group. Tristan de la Luna's fleet is. So they've got a different purpose. They've got sort of a different social outlook, but they're all carrying obsidian with them. Now, maybe I'm overstating the 5 pieces, probably. We don't really know, but you know, I think it's probably much more common than we think in the archaeological record. And you know, why? Why would they be taking them? And you know, I think the best reasoning I've heard is that in early colonial Nueva España, there isn't much in the way of ironworks. So sharp-bladed instruments like razors, hard to come by, but you've got a built-in industry of very, very sharp obsidian blade technology, which can easily step in and take that place. And we know from colonial archives that people were using them. And what would you use them for? Barbering. Clearly, I mean, everybody needs their tonsure trimmed every once in a while with a nice obsidian blade. And you know, this is one of the examples from where we know they were actually commissioning the purchase of obsidian blades to do these sorts of activities. Now, barbering is, you know, at that time, not just cutting hair, but also medical role. So, you know, I think another potential for this could also be as medical tools. Essentially, these are bloodletting tools. Now, you know, the old school anthropologist in me sees this beautiful syncretic story about, you know, native stuff. And it's really interesting that sort of, you know, an indigenous worldview could use these tools in a very similar comparable way, and that maybe it gives, in fact, additional value to European practitioners to use these sorts of tools. You can see here a nice lithograph, which has been fakely colored on the internet, of someone, having a nice day of bloodletting, pouring out her blood into that big bowl. And kind of what really stimulated this was that in a completely unrelated story, we were looking at shipwrecks and we started talking about bleeding bowls, and I didn't know anything about bleeding bowls. But essentially a bleeding bowl is often a pewter bowl which has a cutout in it to go onto your arm or some other place to catch blood. It got me thinking. I knew in the 1554 collections there was this object, which is a pewter porringer which has a cutout. Unfortunately, it's also been smashed, so it's a little hard to interpret. But you can see here where it's basically been cut and rounded and smoothed off. Now, is this a bleeding bowl? I like to think so. Give you an example of what one looks like, a later fancy French version that I found on the internet. I think it's a compelling argument, but at the same time, like, why would people who have these tools need these tools? Well, that's where I had inspiration from Belle. Like, you knew I was getting there somehow or another. So strangely enough, when Belle leaves in the summer of 1684 from France, bound for the New World to found a new colony, there's an engineer aboard named Manet, who writes a very nice, often negative journal of his experiences. But one of the first things that happens to him is, as they're leaving France, he basically gets sick. And they pull over. Anyway, one of the ships broke and had to go to the port of Aix to repair it. And Manet discusses as he's there, he's feeling sick, and his friend Gabrielle Barbier, who had been from Canada, says, well, let me bleed you. Now, okay, I mean, his name is Barbier, it fits. But what's interesting is then Manet says that Barbier, they went to the beach, and I just imagine like Barbier and Manet sitting on the beach together in the lovely summer of 1684. And he broke rocks like the ancient to make a tool to bleed them. So Barbier naps out a tool on a French island and bleeds his friend Manet to make him feel better on a ship full of knives, full of all sorts of sharp tools. There's no reason that they needed this to do this. There's some other cultural logic at play. Now, what it is, I don't know. Again, I like to kind of go back to the Obsidian blades. I've become obsessed, and a lot of this talk is just like places my mind is going with folk medicine in Europe. I don't know much about it, but if anybody does, please come and talk to me later. So again, it seems that there might be things going on with lithic technology that we're not thinking about very often. And it's very hard to see, right? But somewhere, Barbier left debitage on a French beach. Maybe that one. There they are, Manet and Barbier, having a nice bleed on the beach. So fast forward, story of Belle. If you haven't heard it before, look on the internet, read our book. Long story short, LaSalle goes to the New World. It doesn't go well. In 1686, his ship Belle sinks. And then in 1995, the THC positively identifies it and decides to excavate it. That's your very short story. And this is Belle out in Matagorda Bay. Belle was one of LaSalle's smaller ships, definitely a smaller ship when they got to the Texas coast. And it had been basically sent out to sit in Matagorda Bay while LaSalle tried to find its way to the Mississippi. And it was meant to sit there fully loaded to then go to the Mississippi and found the colony they should have found it in the first place when they ended up in Matagorda Bay. So the THC finally finds it after it sinks. The story, please read Chattel's journal, read Weddell's books. It's a great story of incompetence. And unfortunately, I'll keep you here all night if I really enjoy myself with it. So here we are. It was excavated in 96 and 97. They used a cofferdam. Like I said, unlike the 1554 shipwrecks, the Belle was, at least for the lower third, primarily intact. Okay, I got rid of that part. Yeah, so you can just see, here on your right, the full exposure of the hull with much of the cargo still inside. And there weren't obsidian blades. There were 86 casks and 10 boxes and a whole bunch of stuff. And one projectile point, interestingly enough. But what was aboard the ship that ties into this idea of lithic technology were these gunflints, 300 of them. Between 1554 and 1684, a major technological change had occurred in guns. Basically, by the mid-17th century, European military armies had started to adopt flintlock technology. Obviously, Europeans and people had known that you could strike a flint against a metal object and get a spark. But they finally figured out how to cram one into the gun cock and get it to strike and cause a spark that would light the powder in the pan. So all of a sudden, by the 1680s, I would say that lithic technology in Europe had basically undergone a complete and utter renaissance because it suddenly became part of the military industrial complex. And what had been a small sort of remnant industry became industrialized. And these are just some lithographs from later, but what literally happens is they industrialize lithic manufacturing technologies in Europe to produce gunflints by the probably millions for European armies. And so you can just see here an image of what these workshops look like. So you had a whole crew of people who were basically flintnappers. They were flintnappers, and they were producing these for this industry. So, I think it's very interesting to think that by the 17th century, lithic technology is the key factor in the way these guns work. It was stone tools that powered guns. So take that, Jared Dining. And these are just some of the specialized implements they used, and you can see it does not look terribly different than some of the things we see from Texas archaeological sites, polyhedral cores, and the lithic and the styles change. The ones that were found on Belle, what is so striking about them is their regularity. The sizes change, but they're primarily of this. I don't know if this is going to work. The lower left-hand side where it says French gunspall, sort of D-shaped. That's the most common type. It turns into a blade technology over time, but we do see some early ones there. And so, again, you've got all this lithic material. Now here, you're seeing lithics which are being mass-produced, right? We're not seeing the debitage. They tried really hard to find in the ballast of Belle evidence that they were locally making gunflints. They don't seem to have been. And it seems to have been because they were actually pretty smart about packing. So at the same time the Belle was being excavated, Fort St. Louis in Presidio La Bahia, here we'll call it the Kieran site, Grand site, was found, and this was LaSalle's fort at the same time. So, let's flip over there for a minute and look at the French occupation. And this is just the site under excavation by the THC in the late 90s, early 2000. We've got Curtis Tunnel down here in the lower left. For those of you who don't know this story, totally blanking now. Kathleen Gilmore had written this nice report back in the 70s and argued essentially that the Grand site, which was believed to possibly be the location of the French fort, was almost certainly it. But like most things, archaeologists are sometimes hesitant to say this is it. So it left doubt. So even though, honestly, if you look back at her report, she totally nailed it. There remained doubt in the minds of some as to whether or not this site was actually the location of Fort St. Louis. But in the late 90s, the THC got a call from the landowner, and they had discovered what they thought were some cannons. And you can see those down here on the lower left with Curtis Tunnel. And these cannons were critical in the identification of the site, because later when the Spanish actually find the French fort, jumping ahead in time just a little bit, they bury the cannons. And these are the cannons. They forgot about them when they came back, fortunately. So this was the smoking cannon or whatever. Yeah, it's like so easy I have to do it. And you can just see some excavation. And, you know, not surprisingly, in the French occupation, the main lithic technology we see are gunflints. And what are they using it for? Of course, they're using it for guns. But I want to take a minute here to just sort of tell one little story of one of LaSalle's men who gets lost when he's out on a hunting party. And he's by himself, he's got his gun, and he manages to shoot bison, but he doesn't have any other tools. So what he does to skin and prepare the bison, he dislodges the gunflint and he basically treats the bison with the gunflint. So again, here's a European who knew exactly what you could do with these tools. And I like to bring this up because the first gunflint I ever saw, I called a scraper. It didn't even like dawn on me that I was looking at a gunflint. I thought, wow, that's a really cool scraper. And it was a gunflint, but you can see like functionally they work the same way. And these guys, they know how to use stone tools. They're not, I mean, they're getting shot full of stone arrows all the time. I mean, they have to know they're effective at some level. But again, it just shows you that, you know, European knowledge and familiarity with these sorts of tools is not, it's not foreign to them in many ways. Let's see, where am I going with this? Okay, so now, when they did excavate Fort St. Louis, they did find a very interesting pattern. Now, what I'm showing you here in the middle is the site of, it's basically two things superimposed. The little green things you can't see very well, those are all the excavation units. The black line on the outside is the wall of the later Spanish presidio, which was identified archaeologically. The ring of buildings and the inside is part of the Spanish presidio, but then you see these little rectangular buildings kind of scattered around, and those are the actual French buildings. So Bob Rickless did analysis of the lithics that were recovered at the site, and there was a fairly large number of projectile points, especially given the nature of the site. It was a little surprising. And a lot of them are coonies, they are iterations of the Perdiz type, bulbar stemmed. I'll get back to the Guerreros later. And when you plotted them out, what was interesting is, with the exception of the Guerrero points, most of the other points cluster around the actual structures that are French. So what we think, and we're in the process of writing up this book, Tim Perla, I know you're out there, and I swear, just 5 more years. You know, we came to the conclusion that, you know, what you're seeing is sort of a battlefield archaeology here, strangely enough. We don't ever think about this with projectile points, but we think about it a lot with gun casings and sort of later military sites. But in this case, because of the broad aerial excavations, we really feel confident that what you're seeing is a projectile point distribution, which is based on the actual raid of the site. You know, it'll forever remain. I'm gonna, same thing, I just made a comment about Gilmore. You know, as an archaeologist, there's always that sliver of doubt. But, you know, we think from the spatial distribution, a very strong case can be made. And let's see, and here it is, just sort of close up. Unfortunately, it's really hard to read this with my contacts in. What color am I looking for? Yeah, so the blue ones tend to be more the Guerrero points, which I'll explain why I'm even bringing that up in a second. So in addition to the projectile points, one of the other interesting things was there was actually a fair amount of debitage associated with the site, which, you know, I think initially, sort of the initial expectation was that it was probably related to some previous Native American occupation of the site. Again, looking at the spatial distribution, what we found was that debitage patterns cluster very closely in the Spanish colonial habitation areas, which got us asking, you know, how do you interpret that? So the end of LaSalle's story, or at least, well, the end of LaSalle's story is, well, in East Texas, his men kill him for being just a bad leader. But those who stayed at the fort, they hung on till about 1689 when the local, probably a confederation of local groups, essentially attacked and killed all the adults and took the children. Right after that, the De Leon expedition shows up. They actually see LaSalle's fort, they describe it, we get some good information. They come back later, burn it to the ground in 1690, bury the cannons, and kind of go on their merry way until 1720 when they show back up. Kind of thanks to Saint Denis' walk to the Rio Grande, the Spanish got concerned again about French incursions in their territories and began trying to essentially fortify and stabilize their frontier. So they decided to go back to Fort St. Louis because if the French are going to invade, where would they go? Right to LaSalle's fort, of course, because that was such a glorious success. And so they go and they build a presidio, and a pretty impressive one, even if it's not impressive today. You know, they did seem to have built the wall. There's plenty of archival data which suggests that it was not the best maintained once it was built, but they did get it built. And you know, throughout the excavations associated with the Spanish colonial component, you find a lot of the standard Spanish colonial stuff, right? Mahalicas, olive jar, Chinese porcelain. Chinese porcelain fascinates me because it's coming basically through the Philippines to Acapulco and then all the way up to the frontier. Shows you, you know, it's valued. Sort of personal items, tinklers, various religious ornaments, medallions, sort of stuff you would expect to find in a European settlement. Jewelry, I just think these are cool. There's a little bit of, I'm just showing cool things here. And military weapons. It is a presidio after all. Rapier blade, the ubiquitous gun lock with the gunflint in it, and then gunflints. But what's noticeable about the Spanish colonial ones is they're not getting theirs from Europe. Let me pop up one from Belle. They're pretty regular. They're very consistent. They don't I can't think of any I've ever seen that have cortex on them. Compare that to the Spanish colonial over on the other side, and you can see that they are often fairly expediently made. There's a number which still have cortex on them. They appear to be primarily made from local churches. So what you're seeing is that the Spanish colonial response to getting gunflints was very different than the French one. The French were supplying them, they were shipping them. The Spanish colonial forces knew exactly where to get chert. They knew how to use chert. They used chert. So we think that, and we actually worked with Dr. Steve Tomka to do some recollective study on gunflints to see if the debitage in our sample looked like debitage from replicative attempts. And it does. So we think a lot of what we're seeing is, you know, in these sites are lithic technologies brought by the Spanish colonial settlers themselves. I know sometimes it's been talked about that perhaps the Native American groups did this for them. I think Schaefer's comment with VT10, he's talking about that, and just sort of the absurd notion that there's this Native American walking around behind presidio soldiers busily napping out gunflints for them. I just, you know, it sounds good until you kind of think it through, especially in a situation where, like this, where the Spanish and the local groups did not have a very nice relationship. This presidio and the associated mission don't last. This moves up to the Guadalupe. You know, ultimately it becomes VT8 and VT10, which were former TAS field schools, and before they move out to Goliad. And so it's a hard sell for us to think that this debitage is coming from groups that the Spanish put into a room and shot a cannon at because of conflict. So we really think that what we're seeing here is a lithic assemblage made up by the soldiers themselves. And so then all of a sudden, you know, is this a Spanish colonial presidio assemblage? Obviously, the pottery is not necessarily made by them, but we know Spanish colonial communities regularly trade with local groups for pottery. You know, I think the answer is yes. Long story short. And Fox, again, you know, another great inspiration in this, looking at stuff in San Antonio. She wrote, meanwhile, it should be borne in mind that the presence of church flaking debris may not necessarily indicate Indian occupation in the San Antonio area. I think she basically nailed the entire Spanish colonial world, which is not to say, let me just back this up. There are Native American peoples in these places, so they are also manufacturers of some of this debitage. My point here is that we need to not just assume debitage and tools mean local Native Americans. We need to think through who these people are. And that's where we're going to go for the rest of this talk. Who are the people who lived in this mission or this presidio? What I wish I had was Costa data. For people who are not familiar with the Costas, it's a Spanish colonial mechanism of basically organizing racial intermarriage and its offspring. And it's pretty complicated. And I can't get into it here. But you can see in some examples, so this is Presidio Los Dice, this is from George Avery's work, where they've published basically the rosters from 1731. And you can see, maybe you can, maybe you can't, that for a Presidio soldier group, it is not just a bunch of Spanish people identified as such, although there are a number of people identified as Espanol. You'll see that a lot of them are mestizo. They're of mixed Spanish Native American. They're mulatto. There's African in there. There is coyote and lobo, which are, I'm just not even going to say it because I'm going to get it wrong, but they're iterations of different backgrounds, you know, combinations of African and Native American, and it's very interesting. But the point here is just that it is not a presidio full of Spanish soldiers from Spain. It is a presidio made up of people who are recruited from all over, from all sorts of different backgrounds. And when we look at their archaeology, if we don't keep that in mind, we too quickly kind of get trapped in, again, in letting the artifacts drive our interpretation. But what we do have, we don't have this data for our site, but what we do have is the original enrollment roster. So fortunately, Spanish colonial paleography is one of my secret talents. And I was able to get a copy of this actually in Austin at the Catholic Archives. And essentially what it does is it tracks over time how the first 40 soldiers were recruited. And they begin in Mexico City by the descendant of a prominent Spanish landowner. And they move up to Querétaro, San Luis de Potosí, San Luis de La Paz, Potosí, Charcas, Saltillo, Presidio, San Juan Bautista, where basically this is all kind of written down and read and verified. And these 40 guys head over to LaSalle's Fort St. Louis to found the actual presidio. And what's interesting in these recruitment rolls is that it gives a description of the individual. And what it tells you is their name, their hometown, their age. Gives some interesting discussion of their body type. Good size, a little fat, wheat colored, which I think may be a coded term for African. Face redondo, which is kind of round, aquilino, which is sort of aquiline, would be the, and then again, trueño, which is this term which pops up a few times. And then hair, liso, which is sort of straight, crespo, which is curly, black, and then red. A lot of redheads. Still not sure about that one. And you know, here's what it looks like, just to kind of show you. This is talking about, sorry, internet people, Jacinto Charles. He's from Boca de Leones. He's 36 years old. He's good size, a little fat. He's got a round face, and he's got straight black hair. You know, it's hard to really decide what people's lineages are based on that, but it at least suggests that, you know, again, the diversity of the actual community is far greater than 40 Spanish soldiers lets on. And when you start looking at their hometowns, there's a really interesting pattern here, I think. So I don't know how much you guys know about Mexican history, but a lot of northern Mexico was very difficult to conquer. And a lot of it was conquered primarily through cooperation with Tlaxcaltecan groups out of the basin of Mexico. Tlaxcaltecans were a group that early on sided with the Spanish. They got the benefit of that in terms of special service, special rights, and when the crown was trying to move north into Mexico, where the important mining areas were, and they were getting just fierce resistance from local groups, they turned to the Tlaxcaltecans, who had fought with them early on in the Conquista, had gone all over Mexico with them, primarily as archers. They signed an agreement with them that basically the Tlaxcaltecans consider themselves conquistadores del norte. So they are a native group that consider themselves the conquistadors of the north. And the way the pattern worked is that they would go and they would found a city, Saltillo is one. In fact, all these cities are. And with basically a mestizo town, a Tlaxcalan town, the Tlaxcalan town would be linked to the local group, who it was their job to essentially missionize. They would have an independent town with its own cabildo, which was run in Nahuatl, not in Spanish. So they had basically parallel governments. And these towns just spring up. That's what northern Mexico in many places is. They are combined Central Mexican local communities with a mestizo, often very kind of wild population. You start looking at these towns, and it's people from Italy. You know, it's like what? And when we look at the 40 that were brought, they came to our presidio. Only one of them is actually from Spain, a guy who's from Toledo. All the rest are from these towns, and with a few exceptions where we know who their parents are, they seem to be just kind of random folks they could get to join. I'm not sure this was some of the stories about Aguayo's expedition, say that they went in and basically took people out of jails or got people, it's one of those, a little bit of coercion may have been involved. These are the people that this presidio was recruited from, communities which were very mixed. And Frank de la Teja makes a very great, before I get to de la Teja, let me kind of discuss briefly the cultural differences. In Cuba, they have a presidio rules. And in those presidio rules, you have to be Spanish or Criollo, which is basically of Spanish parentage born in the islands. When they write the same rules for Mexico, all that's gone. It's missing, and it's because they couldn't pull that off. They needed local populations. And I think it's really telling that by the 1760s, 1780s, they actually start mandating 10% Indio. They actually mandate diversity into their presidios because they recognize having those individuals there give them openings into local communities. So those are the reglamentos. But Frank de la Teja then has this very good comment about sort of Spanish identity, in that basically it's very fluid on the frontier. So again, it may say they're all Spanish. We've got 40 Spanish troops. It's not necessarily telling you who they really are. It's telling you who the colonial administration would want them to be. So, whose rocks are these? So I told you I'd get back to Guerrero points. We were surprised to have as many Guerrero points. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Guerrero point, triangular shaped point, which is typically found at mission sites, originally identified at the missions in Guerrero, hence Guerrero points. And this is a very, very early presidio. I can't come up with a model where all of a sudden you've got a bunch of missionized Native Americans sitting in the presidio making Guerrero points. Instead, what I would say is that the same people who are making gunflints for their guns are also making projectile points. And it may seem like a stretch. Why on earth would these Spaniards be making projectile points and using arrows? But let's see, what's my next slide? Not what I want. What I don't show you here is that in these communities, all these original people came from, at this very same time, the way militia service is structured is that you have a few Spanish folks, mestizo folks, who have privileges to ride horses, carry guns. The entire rest of the community serves its militia service using bows and arrows and shields, the way that flecheros, basically arrowmen, from native corps have done at this point for well over 100 years in Spanish colonial society. Spanish colonial warfare depends at this time still on the role of native bowmen. So what we'd like to suggest is that, at least in this case, at least some of these soldiers were still carrying on projectile point traditions in this context. And when we ask why does it become so prolific, it is probably because local groups are seeing this technology. I mean, I think there's a whole series of questions which open up. Why this point? Why would they use this? And I think, that's, I'm already over time. It's a talk in and of itself, which I've actually given elsewhere. But, I think the key here in all of these sites is just really thinking through who the people are and expanding our perceptions of who may be responsible for what material culture. And I hope other people, start exploring this too. I now have a newfound appreciation for lithics in any site. And, when we do things like San Felipe de Austin and I find debitage, again, flintlock mechanisms. It's probably much more common. I was terrified, I don't know, terrified, just shocked when my friend's parents came by to pick them up the other day, pick them up, and she's like, oh, debitage. We used to make projector points when I was a kid at camp. So, the Chris Roon staffs and those folks out there, the stuff's, it's very modern. This isn't the Stone Age. We're living with stone tools right now. So here's what I think. That's what presidio archaeology looks like. It looks like stone tools and all sorts of interesting things. So I'll close with Kathleen Gilmore. I want to know, oh man, I'm going to close with a typo. I want to know what they were doing and how they were doing and why they were doing it. After all, it's the people that make history. It's the people that change things. So let's, keep doing all the great archaeological work you guys do and keep thinking crazy thoughts. It's more fun this way. So anyway, I'm going to let you guys free. Thank you very much for having me. I realize it's a lot of territory in a rambling way. I hope it makes some sense. I'll hang out and be happy to talk about it for as long as you guys want. So.
Well, I'm sure there are some questions for you from the floor. So does anybody have a question from the floor in here? Ashley.
How big are Gunflints?
So she asked, how big are Gunflints? I'm sorry, for the folks on Zoom, I repeat the question.
They vary. There's a slide there which shows you kind of generic sizes. Different guns would have different gun lock sizes. So pistols typically had a smaller lock mechanism, so they would have a smaller gun flint. What's sort of useful about the sort of Miquelette lock, which is common in Spanish colonial guns, is that it has a lot of range. So you can pretty much cram whatever you want in there, as long as, maybe not just a giant chunk. But so especially with the Spanish colonial ones, you see a lot of morphological variability. You see, a number of reutilized tools that get, put in there. That's not maybe optimal firing. That would be the nice thing about the finely made French colonial ones or Spanish or Dutch or whoever's making them. They actually had gradations of quality based on basically reliability of actually getting that spark. So I don't really know how to answer your question. They're like from here to there. Actually, there's a nice, Jeff Durst has been writing up Gunflints for both Belle, that's published, as well as Fort St. Louis. So if you're really interested, ask him. I've also unwillingly set Steve Davis on a Gunflint crusade. So Steve Davis would also be more than happy to talk to you about his Gunflint project. So.
All right, what else? Anybody in the room here?
So the people that were, I suppose, conscripted to do the settlement, was this like a lifetime commitment? Did they come and go? How did that relationship go?
They signed up for a period of time. I think it depends. I don't, off the top of my head, have the exact answer. You definitely, a fair amount of them never come back. It's not the best place to work, but a lot of them stick it out for quite a long time. It becomes a profession, I think, for a number of them. But when you look at the roll between 1720 and 1725, which are incomplete, about 50% of the original 40 are still there, and I'm just kind of pulling that out of the air. They added in additional people, so there's a lot of cycling as well. So.
All right, we've got one question here online. First you got some compliments, excellent presentation. Thanks for being here. But then Bill Perdue asked, or first states and then asked, I worked with Donnie Hamilton in the 70s at Tarl, and I don't remember any lithics in the shipwrecks we were working on the conservation of the materials recovered. When did they really start looking for lithics in the Spanish shipwrecks?
I don't know. They came out during the cleaning of the concretions. So there's obviously the ballast, which is also aboard the ship, but I think they just found them. They also found not an obsidian mirror, but like a ground stone mirror. So there were a few lithic objects like that. But again, they were, really unusual, I think, in the shipwreck. So I don't know that they were really looking for them so much as they kind of popped out of the concretions themselves.
Okay, thank you. That's all I'm seeing online right now.
All right. Well, on Zoom, is there anybody on the floor who has a question that's not in the chat? Anybody in Zoom?
More questions? We got another compliment on the presentation.
Anybody else in here on the floor? Got Mr. Brad Jones. All right. All right, folks. Well, I want to wish everybody a good night, and hopefully we'll see you next month for the May meeting. So have a great night. Thank you. Thanks everybody on Zoom. Thanks for attending.